Hi, this is the Untangling Self podcast. I'm Theo, and today I'm here with Bilokonsky, who runs the Public Neurodiversity Support Center and was doing a lot of interesting work helping neurodivergent people connect with themselves. And yeah, I'll start with inviting you, Mick, to talk about yourself, your work, your journey. And thank you for being here and thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I always appreciate an opportunity to talk about this stuff to people who want to hear about it. Um, my journey. So I'm going to start at the end and tell you that I am autistic and ADHD, and I'm going to work backwards. About 5 years ago, I learned that I was autistic and ADHD. Prior to that, I knew something was wrong. I knew something was just, I knew that my relationship to the world was somehow not the same, that I was inhabiting a different reality from everyone else, but I didn't understand why, and I didn't have the vocabulary for it. Moving backwards further, when I was younger in high school, I was adept at that point. I thought, or maybe not, maybe by the end of high school, I was adept at masking, right? I had created a social identity that allowed me to function safely in a space dominated by people who lacked any conception that anyone's reality could be different in the ways that mine was, and who would punish me in all sorts of ways anytime I expressed something that made them suspect that I was different, right? Moving backwards even further, middle school was just baffling, right? Like I already didn't know who I was or how to function. And then you introduce hormones and like the natural human, I guess, urge to classify in group and out group to like create community, like all of these social dynamics begin to emerge in middle school that weren't there in elementary school. Moving backwards to like elementary school, I was fine. I was able to generally understand what my teachers wanted from me and give it to them. I spent a lot of my time really confused, but it didn't really matter because I learned to focus on the things that people paid attention to. I was bullied and I didn't understand that. It didn't make any sense to me, but I just accepted it as like a part of how the world worked, right?
Yeah.
There's a trajectory here that I'm describing in reverse that is the result. Let me be careful how I phrase this. The story that I'm telling you, if you reassemble these parts and tell it in chronological order, a lot of autistic people are going to say, hey, yeah, I had that same experience, right?
Mhm.
Not only in the sense of like I was also in a different reality, but in the sense of once we start comparing notes, it gets down to like, yeah, I was also in like multiple abusive relationships.
Right.
Or, yeah, I also, like, for some reason, spent a long time friends with like a really toxic person who, like, it turns out didn't really care about me. And I sacrificed a lot for that friendship because I thought that's what I was supposed to do, right? Like, there are all of these specific experiences within this broader narrative that are just too coincidental to be more than like parts of that story, right? Like, why those parts? Why that specifically, right?
Yeah.
Because the thing that these things have in common is that we put ourselves into these situations and then we stay in these situations. Why do we do that, right? Why is it that you can talk to an autistic person? Not all autistic people, by the way. I want to preface everything I'm saying
Mhm.
with the clarification that I haven't defined autism, and in this conversation, I'm not going to. That is a different question.
Yeah.
Anything I say about autism is a generalization that will apply to some subset of autistic people, sometimes a plurality, sometimes like a large majority. But there are very few things anybody can say about the autistic experience that are true for every autistic person, which complicates all of this, right?
Yeah.
But that also makes it really interesting and exciting when we identify something that does seem to be true for all of us, right? Or for many of us.
Definitely.
And so in the 5 years since my diagnosis, I've spent a ton of time learning, synthesizing, and applying my autistic pattern recognizing brain to understanding what the hell's going on, not just in my life, not just how did I get here, but how are so many of us here through the choices that we've made, right? What is happening? Can we reason about this, right? Can we find a way to identify the specific thing that we all seem to have in common here?
Mhm.
And it took me 5 years. And it took me a lot of conversations with other brilliant autistic people comparing notes. I want to particularly shout out to Tara Vance, who runs Neuroclastic, which is an incredible resource for autistic information run entirely by autistic people. She linked me to a post she'd written that told a version of this story that I'm about to tell you. When she told this story, it was framed more as a speculative exploration of the consequences of several like autistic traits and experiences, right?
Mhm.
What I saw when I read it was the missing piece for me that allowed me to finally understand. And what I'm going to tell you isn't true, right? True doesn't mean anything when
Yeah.
you understand that reality is constructed, right? What I'm going to
Right.
tell you is a story. And this story describes some experiences that a lot of autistic people will find resonant. Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. Nobody's going to hear this story and say, that's exactly me. If they do, it means I haven't told the story in enough detail. Right.
Right.
So the story
Mhm.
is the answer to the question, what is it that happens to us? And you'll pardon me because there will be points in this where I might get emotional because this is very real.
Yeah.
I approached this by trying to identify the form of trauma that I suspected was driving this, right? I said, we need a name for this thing. We know it's there. What is it? Upon reflection, and after talking to Tara and after arriving at my story, I had the answer. The name of this thing is Autistic Identity Trauma. It
Mhm.
works like this. When you're born, doesn't matter what your neurotype is, right? Every human person that's born is a body with needs.
Yeah.
There is some cognitive processing happening, but the concept of like a self has not emerged and will not emerge for a while, right?
Mhm.
When it does emerge, it's going to be heavily informed by the experiences that that infant has had thus far, right? So the way this is supposed to work is a baby's born, has no way to articulate its needs, but that's okay because it has caregivers, parents, doctors, a community that understand what its needs are and can provide for them, right?
Right.
And generally speaking, this works out okay, right? with a bunch of caveats, right? Like you're only going to get the support that your caregivers are capable of providing. You might have been born into a real shitty situation. You might have been born into a culture that has accepted toxic values that are going to cause you harm,
Yeah.
any number of things, right? But the mechanism works, right? The goal is to turn you into an addition to the culture or society that produced you, right?
Mhm.
And it works unless that infant has needs that deviate in some way from what the caregivers know how to expect, right? And when you're autistic, that's kind of the definition, right? Your experience of the world is different in ways that give rise to different needs. Maybe you're sensitive to sound. Maybe it literally hurts you when somebody makes a loud noise, right?
Yeah.
Literally hurts you. But you were born into a loud, happy family, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, your infancy is going to be spent in agony, despite all the love and support and care in
Yeah.
the world, right? As the self develops, what happens, right? The self is this sort of narrative cognitive construct that exists to mediate those needs, that embodied somatic experience, and the society in which we find ourselves, right? The self is an interface
Yeah. A tool.
that allows us, right,
Hmm.
to connect. And I want to draw a distinction here. When I say self in this way, I'm referring to this abstract technical role of like whatever's going on in the brain, right?
Right.
But I'd like to introduce another term, which is core self.
Hmm.
Your core self is all of those things that are you before, after, and independently of the development of the self, right?
Right.
It's the somatic embodied experience of being you, right?
Yeah.
Your core self is the one that knows that the sound is too loud, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it communicates that to yourself, to your consciousness, somatically, right?
Yeah.
You need, as part of your consciousness's development, to develop the skill set that will allow you to interpret the messages your core self is sending you through your body, right?
Yeah.
This is interesting and tragic because what it means is that if you don't have anybody in your life capable of teaching you how to interpret those messages, yourself will only ever be able to perceive them as discomfort, pain, something's wrong,
Yeah.
right? But you don't know what. You know that there's a part of you that is constantly demanding something from you, right?
Right.
But as you develop, as you grow up, as you learn how the world works, as you develop yourself, you learn that the demands coming from this part of you seem to be irreconcilable with the nature of the world, right? And so you find yourself in this strange situation where you have to decide, do I continue to accept the information that I'm hearing from my core self, which I don't understand and which I can only really interpret as a sense that something's wrong? Or do I trust all the people telling me that nothing's too loud? Everybody gets surprised. It's okay. I just have to like be calm and like everybody's like this, right? Well,
Yeah.
gosh, how do I make this decision? And I'm 6,
Yeah.
right? Does this make sense so far?
Yeah. Yeah. It does. It reminds me of this very fundamental conflict that Gabor Mate talks about between attachment and authenticity, how both of these are primary needs. But of course, like, because as human babies, we are very underdeveloped, we cannot survive on our own, and we very much need attachment for survival. And so we prioritize attachment over authenticity.
We have to, right?
Yeah,
To
we have.
survive.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that model, like that authenticity, like, yeah, the core self, I think of it as a little bit different, and we'll get to why, right? But I think that that model fits, right? We can use that language to refer to this, right?
Yeah.
Authenticity in my model is referred to as the core self. It's the things that are axiomatically true for your embodied experience,
Yeah.
right?
Makes sense.
And attachment, like, yes, that's the mechanism, or that's a model of the mechanism, but it's not the lens that I want to apply here, right?
Mhm.
I very much want to juxtapose the core self and the social self, right? The social self is constructed and motivated by attachment, but that attachment is insufficient. Like, if we just call it attachment, then that's sort of a thought terminating cliche, right?
Right.
It doesn't allow us to further examine what's going on. We just say, oh, that's attachment. But there's something else going on, right? And that's where the next part of the story like connects these things, right? So
Mhm.
you're 6 and you have just decided that you no longer trust the part of yourself that is causing you all of this pain, right? Your relationship to your own authenticity is compromised,
Yeah.
not because attachment is compelling you to seek out something else, but because as you understand the nature of the world and as you make decisions that optimize for your own well-being, right?
Mhm.
You're going to choose logically to situate your trust in the social self, right? Attachment is sort of a metaphor at a higher level of abstraction. To me, what's really happening here is this: the instant you choose to close off that core self, the instant you begin to lock it away, you lose access not only to the negative things it is providing you with, but to the really important positive ones,
Yeah.
right? Which all of which can be defined as axiomatic knowledge of who you are, right?
Yeah.
You have to throw that away too. You can't decouple them, right? And so now your identity is situated fully in your social self. And your social self is attempting to play the role of the core self and provide the things that the core self is meant to provide, but it lacks an embodied experience,
Yeah.
right? It literally can't do that, but it tries, right? So something interesting starts to happen. You are now on a trajectory for what people may identify or refer to 30 years later as codependency. That's another thought terminating cliche. It defines what's happening in terms of how you are being defined by somebody else. That's the origin of the term. Codependents were frequently married to abusers or alcoholics, right?
Yeah.
So, like, the name is just, yeah, abuse, the real problem, and then those people that are drawn to them, right? Like, and it's an afterthought. Nobody's ever broken down the mechanics here that I've found, right?
Mhm.
And the mechanics are really simple, because if the social self is attempting to replicate the functionality of the core self, it needs to replace that somatic grounding with some other form of grounding. What does it do? Well, you're 6, and the people in your life are people who you believe and trust to have your best interests at heart. So
Yeah.
you delegate those decisions to them.
Yeah.
Now, your sense of identity is predicated on the approval of the people around you. That's it. Your whole self is grounded in that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're 6, maybe that's fine, right? Maybe that makes you a particularly well-behaved child, right?
Yeah.
How mature you are. Like, you're such a role model. I wish everybody could be like you. What nobody understands, there's this term people pleaser, right? It's another one of those terms like codependent that's like
Yeah.
sort of an afterthought. It's like a dismissive sing-songy reference to this thing that is like a problem for some people, right? Fuck. No. This is identity dysphoria. When somebody that you are relying on to ground your sense of self tells you that you're wrong, rejects you, like we talk about rejection sensitive dysphoria being common among neurodivergent people, that's what this is.
Yeah.
It's identity dysphoria. Your identity is being fragmented. This breaks your capacity to function because you need that as a human being, right?
Yeah.
So you do anything to win that approval back. As a child, again, this leads to well-behaved, nice children. But nobody teaches you ever that the mechanism you've learned is wrong, and that if you try to apply that mechanism to social dynamics outside of the family where everybody has your best interests at heart on some level, you are going to expose yourself to contradictions and agonies and
Abuse.
abuse that nobody else will even recognize, right? And you will think it's normal. You will think this is just what life is like. And you will think, okay, if this is what life is like, how do I address it, right? How do I make my experience better? Well, I seem to exist purely as this cognitive function whose purpose is to optimize for the happiness of the people around me. So if I want to get better at making them happy, all I have to do is get better at predicting what they're going to do and what they want.
Yeah.
And so from early childhood, you spend years iterating on a cognitive model that's going to allow you to do that. And as a result, not all, but many autistic people develop an incredibly powerful cognitive framework. If you exist purely in a cognitive graph,
Yeah.
and if all of your decisions can be reduced to things that can be represented in that graph, then holy shit, you're kind of a superhero. You can do anything,
Yeah.
right? And so a lucky bunch of us, like we learn to harness that. Masking becomes a trivial operation. We just have to like query the graph, find the function that will make this person happy and like embody it, right? No
Yeah.
problem. But that's a fraction of what we can really do because at this point, we're running an entire simulation of the whole fucking universe in our heads
Yeah.
at all times. It becomes the mechanism whereby we solve any problem we face. Whenever we find a challenge or we lose or we fail, we learn and we adapt our cognitive model so that the next time we're faced with a similar decision, we won't make that mistake. And over decades, we turn into people who can give you profoundly meaningful answers to questions about things we don't know anything about. We can just do that. But if you ask us, who are you? You can watch our cognitive framework jam up in real time.
Mm.
right? If
Yeah.
I care about you and I'm committed to you and I'm in a loving relationship with you, and you ask me, you love me, right? My entire fucking framework is going to collapse because in order to answer that question, I need access to myself.
Yeah.
Myself at this moment is defined and grounded by the person I'm talking to. So why is this person asking me if I love them? What the fuck? No, they should be able to tell me based on
Yeah.
like how I'm acting and like how I'm demonstrating, right? Like
Mhm.
the fact that they don't know if I love them means something's really wrong, right? Like the kinds of anxieties that you fall into,
Yeah.
it it's just so much, right? And this leads to abusive relationships. It leads to time, like a disproportionate number of autistic people have lost years to cults,
Yeah.
right? You can see why. A cult is optimized for providing a self to people who need it.
Mhm.
That's why they exist, right? So, okay, we have this mechanism. We understand now what's going on, at least on some level. What do we do about it, right? What does it look like if we've identified this wound? What would healing this wound look like?
Mhm.
Well, I guess it would look somehow like recognizing, first of all, that I am a part of a larger system. I'm a subset of myself. And I don't know how to reason about that. But there seems to be something here about my body and somatics and about listening to those parts of myself that I've walled off so thoroughly that I don't even know they're there. So, how do I address that? How do I learn to solve this problem, right? And so, as a good autistic person, you think, all right, let me update my cognitive model
Yeah.
and try harder, right?
Mhm.
And you spend some time doing that. And eventually you realize this is never going to work. There is no amount of cognitive modeling of an emotion that will ever allow me to experience that emotion. It's a category error, right? And the idea that there's a part of myself, this core self, whose function is to provide those things that I'm constantly seeking in other people, is the missing piece. It allows me in my cognitive model to sort of asterisk the whole thing and consider alternatives, right?
Yeah.
And so, following this process, I started asking myself a bunch of questions. And where that led was okay, I know autistic people. I also know that if there's a way out, right? If there's a recovery from this, some subset of people in history have found it, right? And I know autistic people, they wouldn't have been able to shut up about it. They would have been shouting it from the rooftops to try to help everybody else,
Yeah.
right? But we don't have any record of any of that. Weird. What happened? Does that mean that nobody's ever recovered? Well, maybe, but maybe we can reflect on cultural context and history. Most autistic people on Earth today in 2023 are undiagnosed adults,
Mhm.
right? That has only ever been more true the further back in history you go. And you don't have to go very far back in history at all to get to a point where no autistic person knew they were autistic,
True.
right? So let's assume then, let's go back to 1920. Let's assume that you're like an autistic person who has experienced this arc and who's found a way through it, right? What would you have done? How would you have communicated that experience? Well, you didn't have a psychological model to frame this as a mental pathology, so you wouldn't have written an update to the DSM.
Yeah.
You didn't have the neurodiversity movement, right? So you didn't have language to articulate neurotypes and things like that. What you had was a society into which you did not fit. And for all you know, you're alone, even though other people have probably had similar journeys. No two autistic people are the same, and your journey is exact to you. So, okay, you've been through this thing. You came out the other side, and nobody has any frame of reference to even understand what it was. What do? You make art.
Yeah, you make art.
So, okay, I studied British literature in the modernist era. Hypothetically, can I think of somebody in that period whose writing is articulating an autistic experience? Joyce, Woolf, Ford Madox Ford, TSL. Wait, can I name one who isn't? All of these things, these definitive works of art that form movements, are attempts to grapple with ineffable, inarticulable human experiences that we don't have language for.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest of those experiences is neurodiversity. Because of the nature of neurodiversity, many of us are very creative, very expressive. We are compelled to make art, right? We're compelled to tell our stories.
Mhm.
And so with this reframing, suddenly you look back at the history of art and you don't see a bunch of like random things that were chosen because they appealed to like their patrons, right? Although of course that's there.
Yeah.
What you see is those artworks that you've encountered in your lifetime that hit you like a bus and that you had no way to articulate what the fuck even just happened, but they changed you, right?
Yeah.
Because those are your maps. Those are the people whose journeys reflect yours most accurately. For me, it was James Joyce reading Portrait of the Artist. Like,
Mm.
I read it as a teenager and it shook me. And then I revisited it as an autistic adult and I was like, oh, fuck yeah, he's trying to tell this story without any of the language or concepts he needs, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so something really interesting happens. The process of identifying and healing autistic identity trauma becomes the process of immersing yourself in the art that has spoken to you most meaningfully, right?
Yeah.
It becomes the process of learning to feel things in your body that you've been ignoring. It becomes the process of trying to figure out how to think without engaging that cognitive model. What would it mean to just be a person and not a computer,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? How much of that model could I turn off if I were able to get in touch with this hypothetical core self, right? What would that look like? What would that feel like?
Yeah.
Can I turn to art to help me answer these questions? And the answer is fuck yeah. I spent like by day I'm a software engineer, but I spend a lot of my time thinking and about this stuff. And I offer free coaching to autistic people who
Hmm.
are struggling with these problems. Um, in those coaching sessions, I tell them this story, and then I say that I'd like to choose a particular piece of pop culture that I feel is supremely emblematic of this, right? That like is a really good map and that it may not be their map, but that if we can find a way to use it as a map, we can get into some really powerful metaphors here, right? And so we talk about the Matrix.
Right.
Now, when the Matrix came out, everybody was blown away, right? Entirely by the surface level film. There were probably no viewers, right, who understood that this was a movie created by two closeted trans women about the experience of being trans and about what's required to live a healthy life as a trans person. Now, I'm going to say something here that I believe, but that can be a little bit controversial. And I'll talk about why and about why I make the choice that I make. Neurodiversity says that we have all these different traits, right? And that most people have roughly the same value for those traits, but that some people have wildly divergent values for some traits, right? And those can be hypersensitivity to a sense, hyposensitivity to a sense. They can be like cognitive processing things, they can be emotion related, attention related, all sorts of ways. A neurotype has all these dimensions. I believe it's self-evident to me that included in those dimensions are things like sexuality and gender identity, right? Which suggests that queer people are neurodivergent, right? By definition. But due to the cultural forces and the way these things played out over the history of the 20th century, certain forms of neurodivergence emerged into culture in isolation and developed as isolated identities, right? And so this happened with like LGBTQ stuff. And it took gay people a long time to claw their way out of the DSM, right? Like homosexuality was pathologized in the same way that autism is. And when I say that like being autistic is just a different way of being queer, a lot of gay people hear me saying, you belong back here in this pathologized like space with us, right? And it's threatening. It feels like I'm trying to drag them back. But that's not what I'm doing. What I'm trying to say is, y'all need to pull the rest of us with you because you didn't do it right and you didn't understand what was happening. And if you stop here, you're not living up to the values that you purport to hold, right?
Yeah.
And so this is a conversation that's going to take years to unfold, but it informs my choice to use The Matrix as a film here because an intentionally crafted story about the trans experience is also then a story about the autistic experience. And it turns out that the form of identity trauma that trans people experience is very similar to the autistic identity trauma. In fact, this makes sense because they're probably reflections of the same core mechanism, right?
Yeah.
So what that means is that they made their movie, but they encoded everything and they abstracted everything to remove the transness, right? Which is powerful. Like it's tragic because they had to do that even to make the thing. But as a result, they've given us an abstraction that applies to neurodiversity in general, right?
Yeah.
There are details in the movie that are specific to the trans experience, and I don't want to erase that. There's a lot of them. But we can also see the movie now as this map of autistic identity trauma and recovery. And the map looks like this. Thomas Anderson is born into a world where something is wrong. He's lived decades. He's had the failed relationships and the abusive jobs and whatever. He's jaded. He's broken. He can't take it anymore. There's got to be another way. His very identity has fragmented because he no longer identifies with Thomas Anderson, the social self.
Yeah.
Right? He knows that was wrong. He's Neo, but who is Neo? He doesn't know. Right? He's curious. He's driven, and he wants to know what is the matrix. Because in his research, he's uncovered the idea that maybe reality isn't a single shared, like objectively true thing. But he doesn't even know how to begin to reason about that, even though on some level he knows it, right?
Yeah.
So he goes about his night, he meets Trinity, and he has a great interaction with Trinity where he says, "Oh, I thought you were a dude." And she says, "Most guys do," right? Like Trinity in this movie is the core self because this movie is operating on multiple levels. And the level that we care about here says The crew of the hovercraft is the main character. It's a single person. The various members of the crew are like IFS parts. IFS is internal family systems, right? It's a therapeutic modality which says that we can decompose our self into parts that are acting semi-independently, right?
Yeah.
And so like Morpheus, for instance, is faith. He is unwavering commitment, right? This is like something that makes us human, right? Is the capacity to choose what to believe. Morpheus represents and embodies that. He's wrong about every fucking thing he ever believes. This is crucial. Totally wrong. But if his faith had wavered even once, everything would have been lost.
Yeah.
He has a role to play, and he knows that. His dialogue reflects that constantly. He doesn't care what the oracle told me out. She told you what you needed to hear. I don't want to know. Nothing, the oracle says nothing anybody says to Morpheus will ever change his mind, right? That's his function. Other members of the crew, you've got, and this is not, by the way, just my analysis. I've read a lot of trans analysis in particular to better understand what's happening here. You've got Tank, right? The person who's like the controller who is interfacing with them when they're in the matrix and injecting skills and giving them embodied knowledge. He represents community, right? He's the connection to the whole context, right, of knowledge that we have access to. Every member, like Cypher, is doubt. He's the self-destructive part that's the antithesis of Morpheus, right? Trinity is special. In IFS, we talk about the self as a special part. Its job is to coordinate the messages from all the other parts and decide what to do with them, right? The other parts are not supposed to have like right access to your behavior. That's supposed to be mediated through yourself. But unless you're integrated, unless you have a healthy, fully like developed capacity for yourself to receive and process all the kinds of messages it may be sent, that can go haywire and parts may find themselves driving from time to time, right? And so in this metaphor, to bring it back, Trinity is the core self. She's not the self in an IFS way. She's not the person who makes the decisions. She's the part that knows what's true. She's the part that knows who she is, right?
Right.
She's the part who can make choices. Everybody else is kind of driven by their role. Trinity makes decisions, right? But when the movie begins, this crew is missing something. They've been searching for the one for years. What's the one? The one is the missing piece. It's the IFS self. It's the thing that is going to allow the entire system to integrate and function as one, right?
Right.
This is a story about integration. Because in the absence of a self, right, some other part plays that role. So the metaphor here is our abstract character has identity trauma, right? They have a part, Trinity, who knows what's true, right?
Right.
But that part doesn't have the capacity to integrate all those other parts, right? It needs the coordinator. It needs that missing piece, which is going to understand how to interpret and respond to each part's messages, right? That's the one on this level of the plot. And so how does this go? They give Neo the red pill, right? It confirms everything intuitively he understood, but it does so by stripping away all the context he required to even begin to understand what was happening. Suddenly he wakes up in an artificial womb in a mechanical environment that looks like hell. Some sort of robotic mother droid comes up and removes the umbilical cord from his neck that connects him to everything he needs to live and flushes him until he's floating in a river of shit in a body he's never used with no idea what's going on.
Uh,
This is adult autism diagnosis.
yeah.
That vague sense you've had that everything is wrong, it was true. You want to know the truth? Here. Oh, now you're treading water. It's still the same reality that you were in, but the glamour is off. The illusions are gone. You see all the people that you're used to interacting with, people that you love and trust, and they're zipping around on like jet skis and like cruise liners having a grand old time. And you're treading water and drowning. And you're like, what's happening? Somebody help me. And instead of throwing you a life preserver, they gently start suggesting that you're making a lot of noise, right? And
Yeah.
that's the experience of learning you're autistic as an adult. Like everything you thought you knew and could rely on is gone. And you have to learn now who you are. But the only tool that you have in your toolbox to do that is the cognitive processing that you've been perfecting all these years.
Yeah.
And so as you tread water, you try and try and try to come up with explanations and strategies that are going to solve this problem. Nothing works. Nothing seems to help. What happens? And this is the part where people come to me, right? Because my pitch for my coaching is, okay, you're autistic. You've taken a year or two to understand what that means. You've accepted it.
Hmm.
You've lost friendships. Your life has changed, but you've achieved a point of stability, I guess, but you still feel like something's wrong.
Yeah.
What's next, right? Well,
Hmm.
there's a reason that the matrix begins with Neo getting flushed, doesn't end with it, right? That's not
Yeah.
integration. That's recognition of the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
But let's use the matrix as a map. Let's see how much of our story we can fit into like what happens in this, right?
Yeah.
Instead of being abandoned to tread water, Neo's immediately rescued by the Nebuchadnezzar. He's removed, he's lifted from the water. He's washed, he's allowed to rest, he's fed, he's given just enough context to understand that he's safe and that he can learn more as he's ready, right?
Yeah.
This is pretty good. Okay, I can see how being welcomed by a community would be a big difference in the autistic experience. And that's what the neurodiversity movement's trying to do now. We're trying to reach people who
Yeah.
are treading water, right? But we're all still like the hovercraft looking for the one, right? We're not healed, we're stable.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's watch the movie. How's this going to play out? Well, okay, Morpheus runs his big mouth and tells Neo that he's the one. What's that mean? Well, it's kind of vague. And surface level, it means you're sort of the superhero that can do things in the Matrix.
Hmm.
Okay, fine. So we go visit the Oracle, who knows everything. We don't know anything about her, why we should trust her, what her powers are, anything, but she's confident. Okay. And she says, no, you're not the one. You're close, but it's not you. Maybe in another life. Sorry. How did she know that? Well, she asked Neo. That was it. She said, are you like, what do you think? And he's like, and she's like, well, if you're the one, you know it, balls to bone. It's in your body. It's axiomatic.
Right.
You're not the one.
Yeah.
Neo's crushed. He leaves. He goes to tell Morpheus, right? Like, hey, heart, your faith is misplaced. You need to like stop and update what you're doing. And Morpheus doesn't want to hear it. No, that's not how this works, right?
Right.
I do what I do. You do what you do. The Oracle tells Neo that Morpheus is going to be killed because of his mistaken belief, but that Neo will have an opportunity to sacrifice himself to save Morpheus. All right, interesting. allegorically complex. Let's see what they're doing with this, right?
Yeah.
We get the betrayal, we get Morpheus's capture, and then we get the meat of the movie. Neo, now aware that reality is different than he understood it to be, is taught that the Matrix, that his power in the Matrix is not a function of his muscles, but of his will, of his cognition, of his belief, of his faith, right? In other words, your ability to succeed here scales with your ability to perform complex operations with your cognitive model. Okay, so far so good, right? This is mapping to the autistic experience. As we watch Neo attempt to rescue Morpheus, we watch him rapidly iterate on his understanding of the nature of the Matrix, himself and his relationship to it, update his model in real time, and rapidly become incredibly powerful until within an hour he's a fucking superhero. He's dodging bullets. He beat Smith in hand-to-hand combat. Maybe he is the one, right?
Right.
And then he gets gunned down and dies. Smith just kills him, outthinks him. Oh, didn't expect that. What happens? In the base movie, we get a nice little Hollywood twist, right? Trinity leans over and says, oh, but I love you. Like, you can't be dead, right? And through the magic of movies, Neo stands back up and is now the one, and we get a happy ending.
Yeah.
Fine. But what's it really doing? Because that's not the story it's telling. What it's really doing is showing that no amount of effort Neo is capable of making will ever allow him to be the one. He will never, ever, ever will himself into becoming the one. It's impossible.
Yeah.
This is shown to us, and he's killed. But what happens in the higher plot? The core self reaches out and says, you can't be dead because I love you. That means that up until that point, Neo, your identity was still predicated, was still at least informed in some degree by the opinions of other people, as expressed in our metaphor here as bullets. Those bullets matter to you, and so you're dying.
Wow.
But what I'm trying to tell you is that the only thing that matters is that I love you. And that's enough. And we have, in the next scene, one of my favorite moments of physical acting I've ever seen. Because up until that point, Keanu Reeves has been transforming from mild-mannered nerd to like raging like barbarian, right? Through the lens of like cyberpunk cool, right?
Yeah.
But like he's exuding power. When he stands up, his body language is 100% different. The only thing that I've seen that comes close to it is fucking Kylo Ren and Ben Solo in the third Jedi movie, where Adam Driver becomes Ben Solo, and you realize that his entire body is the performance, and he's a completely different person. It's incredible. Same thing. Neo stands up, and every ounce of effort is gone. He is utterly at peace. There is nothing to strive against. He doesn't need to dodge the bullets, as Morpheus foreshadows early in, right? I'm telling you that by the time you're done, you won't have to dodge the bullets. This is the thing.
Yeah.
Bullets are just another argument coming from the outside with an opinion about who Neo is. But Neo has finally understood that there is exactly one person whose opinion matters, and that's Trinity.
Yeah.
And that's the moment of integration. Yeah. What's up?
Yeah. I'd love for you to go into, like, there's this sense that something is wrong that is ever present
Yeah.
throughout our life. And there's this nagging voice, there's this pull, but we never really listen to it, or like people who have having this experience are not able to honor that voice.
Because you're taught not to. You're taught to
Yeah.
you're taught, oh, everybody deals with stuff. Just ignore it, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I'd love for you to connect it to shame, which I believe is
Oh,
very,
I'm so glad you asked that, because in
yeah.
my coaching sessions, I didn't even talk about this before this. Um, in my coaching sessions, the next section is shame, right? Because shame is the fundamental mechanic that drives all of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So to understand how this works, first I'm going to tell you another personal anecdote. Then I'm going to give you a metaphor that will reframe your understanding of shame and allow you to treat it differently.
Mhm.
Okay. The personal anecdote is this. I read Victor Hugo's Les Mis when I was 16. I don't know if you've ever read it.
No.
I recommend it. It is the story of a man who steals a loaf of bread, goes to prison, tries to escape, gets his sentence extended. Da, 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 da. By the beginning of the novel, he's released after 20 years in prison. He has nothing. The world is cruel. And a priest invites him in for the night and offers to like bathe him and feed him. In the middle of the night, he gets up and he steals the priest's plates
Mm.
and he leaves. And in the morning, the guards bring him back and say, Father, we caught this man like absconding with your goods. And the priest says, oh, thank goodness you brought him back, my friend. I told you you should take the candlesticks too. Those plates aren't nearly enough. And the novel is a sprawling 800-page epic about Napoleonic Europe. But the main character of the novel, through my framing, is that act of grace. The novel is the story of that act of grace multiplying and flowing through a graph that shows you, demonstrates conclusively that every subjective experience is equally sacred, divine, worthy, that there is nobody who is beneath our notice,
Yeah.
right? That book, when I was 16, taught me that other people were real in a way that I hadn't understood. And I heard that there was a Broadway musical about it, but I thought, how could you possibly reduce this into like a Broadway musical? I'm not even interested. And then 20 years later, my 8-year-old brother-in-law was cast to play Gavroche in a high school production of Les Mis, right? Gavroche is a little French urchin. He's a wonderful character. And so we all went to see it. And I was blown away. I had a transformative experience and I learned what shame was. There are two scenes. So first of all, the musical, from the opening notes of the opening song, shows you that they understand exactly what the novel is about. I was like, wait, what? Okay, I'm paying attention. And I'm watching a bunch of high school kids tell this version of this story with these songs. And there's a scene where a young girl, an orphan, sings a song about a castle in a cloud. She's talking about how she imagines she likes to go there when she's sad, and it has all these details, and it's this vivid, joyful fantasy life. And then her evil stepmother comes out and tells her she's being lazy and has to do chores and won't amount to anything. And I'm
Mhm.
like, don't you see what you do? That's like an autistic kid. They're so creative. They're building this wonderful, it's beautiful, and you're just shaming them for it.
Yeah.
But you're just giving them shame only to control them. Don't you know the effect that shame's going to have on them? And I thought, oh, you know exactly the effect that shape's going to have on them. And I just like started processing, right? And I realized I was reacting so strongly because I saw myself in that scene. And I remembered every time I had ever been shamed for just delighting in what delighted me. And I recognized that in all of those moments, what they had in common was that shame was being given to me by somebody who wanted to change my behavior because they were uncomfortable for some reason.
Yeah.
But that doesn't create any obligation at all on my part to accept that shame, right? And I'm sitting here like trying to process this. Like, how is it that my life to this point has been defined almost entirely by shame? But the mechanism is that, like, it doesn't have legitimacy. It's just somebody else's shit. Like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Sitting there on the edge of my seat, sobbing, watching these high school kids perform this musical. And the play takes place over the course of a lifetime. And so our protagonist at the end is he's lived a good life. He's helped so many people. He's like a wonderful person, and he's on his deathbed. And the only person there with him is the fiance of his adoptive daughter. We don't really trust this person. We don't know him, but at least he's there. And our protagonist is trying to confess. He's telling a story about a person he knew once who committed a crime and went to prison, right?
Hmm.
And the other guy's not sure why he's telling this story. And he can't get the words out. He can't quite communicate why this is so meaningful, but he's so urgently trying to communicate it.
Yeah.
And then he stops. He's ashamed. He can't do it. He can't say it was me. And it's so heartbreaking. And then the other character figures it out. And this fucking 16-year-old kid on stage just stood up and sang, "You're Jean Valjean." And I lost it. I completely lost it. I understood everything. Like, it changed me because what I experienced in those 2 hours was first the understanding that I was carrying around so much shame that it was obscuring and concealing my actual self in some way,
Yeah.
but that I didn't have to carry that shame, that it wasn't mine. And second was the understanding that if I made it to my deathbed without anybody ever seeing the full me, I will have failed in some really important way. I will not have lived a full, healthy life, right? We are social animals. There's codependency, which is I need other people to tell me who I am.
Hmm.
But then there's identity within a collective, which is I need my peers to acknowledge, understand, and recognize me as such.
Yeah.
And that's different. It's solving a different problem. And so for me and my relationship to shame, this was such a profound realization that it allowed me in a single moment to put down the shame that I had been carrying my whole life. I'm not joking when I say that the next day at work, my coworkers told me that I was walking differently.
Wow.
I felt it in every fiber of my being. I felt 2,000 pounds lighter. I felt like I wasn't being weighed down in every moment. I felt free in a way that I'd never felt.
Mhm.
And I understood that this was the beginning of the journey, not the end, right?
Yeah.
I still had to figure out how to like identify what exactly was missing, how to communicate that in a way that would allow me to receive it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like that's what led to my work and my stuff around autistic identity trauma and my coaching. And like that's why I fucking love the Matrix so much, because it is explicitly about this. And what's particularly amazing about the Matrix
Mhm.
is the sequels, because most people think of the Matrix as an amazing sci-fi movie, and the sequels is kind of like these, yeah, sort of incoherent but kind of stylish, like add-ons that like fleshed out the brand, right? That's not what the sequels were. at all. And there's a line of dialogue that is a key to like everything the movie's doing, everything the entire thing is doing. And it's spoken by the Oracle. She tells Neo, nobody can see past a choice that they don't understand. In the context of the film, this is like a diegetic claim about the nature of like divination and being able to tell the future, right? She's explaining the constraints on what's possible,
Yeah.
right? But this is also an instruction and a warning to the viewer. It's saying if you don't actually understand the choices that we made in the first movie, you have no hope of understanding what we're doing moving forward,
Mhm.
right? And so to a savvy, committed critic, it's a challenge. It says, we showed you in the Matrix what we're capable of. So trust us as you watch this and think about what would have to be true. What choices don't you understand? And that's your key to figuring out like what this movie's really doing, right?
Mhm.
And the whole trilogy, the first two movies end with Rage Against the Machine, right? Yeah, fight, we're at war, fight the machines. It's a metaphor, same metaphor, love it. The third movie ends with a techno beat with some words that I didn't understand or recognize, except for I was watching it recently with somebody trained in like musical traditions from around the world.
Mhm.
And as the credits rolled, they sat bolt upright and said, do you know this Vedic chant? And I said, no, I don't know this Vedic chant. And she said, I think, yeah, this is the one that is used to consecrate the completion of a sacred offering to the divine,
Ah,
right? Everything about these movies was intentionally crafted. It wasn't a clever sci-fi movie and then two like big budget sequels.
mhm.
It's scripture. The first book tells you, shows you what it means to become an integrated person. The second book says, hey, you made it. Congratulations.
Mhm.
You may have thought that integration solves all your problems. That's not technically true. What it does is allow you to engage with the next set of problems.
Yeah.
And some of those are pretty serious. For instance, you are now in community with other integrated people. But we are a minority and we exist within a context where the majority not only hates us, but is actively seeking to destroy us.
Mhm.
And we could really use your help because they're going to be here in 12 hours, right?
Mhm.
That's
Right.
the frame of the second movie. The third movie says it's a recapitulation of the first movie, but through a transform, right? The first movie says integration is only possible by yielding to yourself. The third movie says that our most sacred duty, the greatest thing that we can do, is contribute everything that we are to something bigger than ourselves by yielding to that.
Mm. Well, yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
Neo's arc, right? And that's why it's not just about integration. It's a sacred offering. It's a depiction of like, it's not the hero's journey, it's the queero's journey, right? It's like it's something else.
Yeah.
It's like, and it fits and it works in a way that intuitively makes sense if you have certain values and experiences, and which is absolutely incoherent if you don't.
Mhm.
And I find that fascinating.
It is fascinating. Well, yeah. Mhm. As we move towards closing the conversation, I would Like, what would you say to someone who really resonated with all of that and, yeah, who finds themselves here? And what's the next step from here?
Yeah. I would say follow me on Twitter, Mykola, Mykola.
Mhm.
Uh, I'm available for free coaching if you would like to talk about this. But where that coaching is going to go is a lot of it's going to be telling you this story and then like applying it to your life and then offering you some strategies for how you can begin your own integration.
Right.
And there are two strategies specifically that I'm going to like close with, right? And you can
Mhm.
use these right now. The first one is we're going to go back to the matrix as a metaphor. You're treading water, right? You're Neo, you've just been flushed and there's no hovercraft. You're treading water, you've been treading water for years. You know this is not sustainable. Every once in a while, though, your feet brush up against a sandbar and you get to rest. Now, in this metaphor, these sandbars seem to be random and unrelated. These are things like spending time with that friend who just understands you.
Mhm.
These are things like indulging in your favorite video game for 8 hours. These are things like doing a research project just to learn more about something you're curious about. They're things like dancing to a song that like just moves you, right?
Right.
My favorite example here is sexual in nature, so I don't necessarily want to name it if that's not appropriate, but if it's fine, I'll tell you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Um, I like to use orgasm as a metaphor here, right?
Right.
All of these things have something in common that is probably not obvious to you, but that will be immediately undeniable once you learn to see it. These are all experiences where you're not doing the cognitive work of processing your existence. You're
Yeah.
just existing, right? When you're playing video games, you're not second guessing what that means about who you are as a person and what the third order consequences might be if the wrong person sees you playing the wrong game at the wrong time. You're just trying to finish this quest.
Yeah.
That's fun, right? If you're dancing to your favorite song, the minute you start thinking too much about your dance moves, you're going to falter, right? You're going to lose that flow.
Hmm.
You can't both will yourself into having an orgasm and experience an orgasm. You can't do it,
Yeah.
right? And orgasm is only possible by yielding, right? What do these things all have in common? These things are those moments in your life where where a tiny fraction of your core self is still able to break through,
Yeah.
right? These are moments where you're enough and you feel like you're enough and you don't need anything else and you can rest. And in our metaphor, you're going to realize that these aren't sandbars. These are the fingertips of a colossus that's been buried in a river of shit. That colossus is your core self. It's bigger than you can imagine, and it's filled with love. It all it wants to do is tell you that you're okay. But it's buried by so much shame that you can only reach it indirectly in these fleeting moments, right? But let that be sort of a guide and inspiration to what's possible once you learn to intentionally reach for it. And then once you learn to ground yourself in it, right? To
Yeah.
do that, you have to drain the shame. And that is going to require something different for everyone. I don't have a map for that for you,
Hmm.
but I'm happy to talk about it in a coaching context. The other avenue of healing is recognizing that you're not alone and that you never were. Recognizing that the autistic experience connects you to an invisible diaspora that stretches back into human time, and that we've always been here, and that you can recognize us by the art that we make. And so, homework that I give people is, hey, do you like the Talking Heads? Have you ever listened to the Talking Heads with the understanding that David Byrne is autistic? Have you ever read their lyrics through that lens since realizing that you're autistic? If not, take the week and do that. And then in particular, go listen to his solo albums and listen to his trajectory as he shows you his process of integrating his self and recovering from his shame. That's what his art is about, right? Go read Joyce, go read Virginia Woolf, like go listen to Beyonce. Like nobody who is creating art at the level of these people is neurotypical.
Yeah.
It's impossible. It requires the degree of single-minded focus and dedication that's only possible, only accessible to those with the neurotype that enables it, right? And it comes at a cost. It's not a superpower, it's a trade-off, right? Bill Gates needs help brushing his teeth. These are true, right? That's not a value judgment. The model here is embrace the idea that there are other ways of being that have always been at odds with the mainstream and that have always been valid, and find them in art. Go revisit that novel you read when you were 12 that left you shaking, right? Go put on that album that like scared you because it was too intense with like the emotions you felt. Like these are your maps and they're going to help you.
That was powerful. Thank you so much. And I hope
Thank you
this
so much for listening.
finds the people who need it and who use this as a map to discover themselves.
I thank you so much for helping me create this artifact and for understanding like the value of this, because I can't articulate the difference between waking up every day and thinking, what do I need to do to make everybody happy so that I can stop being afraid? And waking up and thinking, what do I want to do that will bring me joy?
Mhm.
And until you learn to heal this, you don't even understand what this looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. So glad to have played this role. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.